wherever you are. Hope you're having a good day. Welcome to this webinar on measuring norms regarding child marriage at scale. While we're still waiting for folks to join, we have a good list so far. We're going to just ask you a question on the poll on screen that our friend Kate is going to pop up. And if you can just answer the poll, and in the chat box, hopefully everyone is familiar with the chat function of Zoom these days, just write your reason for the answer that you gave. So Kate, if you're able to share that poll question.
Yeah, just a second.
Okay. And while she's doing that, let me just quickly introduce myself. I'm Suzanne Petroni. I am a consultant who has done some work with the Learning Collaborative, with the Align Project on child marriage. So have seen many of you all in various places around the world. Great to see you online today. And what we're going to be doing today is talking about norms, and specifically measuring norms as they relate to child marriage, recognizing that norms differ in different contexts, and in some places child marriage is seen as the norm, the right thing to do, and in other places it is decidedly not a norm. We know that norms are complex, and we know that it's not necessarily easy to measure them. So what we'll be hearing about today is an innovative way to try to do that. And we've got the agenda structured. You'll see that in just a minute, in a way that really allows for hopefully robust participation from a variety of the experts that are joining us on this call. So really happy to have you all and recognize you're representing a huge range of backgrounds and expertise around the world. So it looks like Kate is maybe not able yet to open the...
Yeah, I'm not sure what's happening. I don't think it's gonna work.
Okay. So we'll just skip that quiz function. We've got, I think, most, well, we've got quite a few people at this point on the call. So I think we're good enough. We were just going to ask you what region of the world you're chiming in from. So maybe we could just use the chat function to do that instead. If you just want to put your name and organization and where you're calling in from in the chat box, that would be helpful just to give us a sense of who's here. So thanks for starting that. And I'm sitting in Arlington, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. Looks like we've got folks from all over the world we're seeing. That's great. Nice to see some of my former colleagues here. The other thing that we are doing on this webinar is that you'll see we do have closed captioning. We recognize we want to be as inclusive as possible, and it's not the perfect technology, but for those of you who maybe need or benefit from seeing our words typed out, it's at the bottom of the screen here. So hopefully that is helpful to you. And the last thing I want to say, just by way of introduction, is that this call is being recorded, so we can make it available to those who weren't able to join us previously. Okay, so you see the agenda here. And after I finish my opening remarks, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rebecca Lundgren for some opening thoughts. Then on to Shipra Jha from Girls Not Brides Asia, Dr. Yvette Efebvre from the Gates Foundation, and then we'll have the one presentation from Dr. Holly Shakya. And then we're going to have a facilitated discussion. We've asked a few individuals to provide their thoughts, and then we'll open it up to whoever wants to weigh in. And then we'll close by 11:15 with Dr. Natasha Stevanovic. So with that, and I'll say that we are going to keep folks muted during the call, but please feel free to use the chat function along the way. If you have questions, we'll try to consolidate those along the way and then bring those up during the discussion period. So with that, let me go ahead and turn it over to Rebecca, Dr. Rebecca Lundgren, who is an associate adjunct professor at the Center on Gender Equity and Health at the University of California, San Diego. She also leads the Passages Project, which is working to bridge the gap between science and effective policy and practice through research, technical assistance, and support for scalable normative interventions focused on improving adolescent health and well-being. So with that, I'll ask Rebecca to chime in.
Hey everyone, I'm so excited to be here with you all. I see so many names of friends and colleagues from across the globe scrolling across my screen, which is a great feeling on a morning, which it is here in San Diego. And I just also like to recognize my colleagues from the Institute for Reproductive Health at Georgetown University who work closely with me on the Learning Collaborative and also on Passages. So as Suzanne said, this webinar is hosted by the Learning Collaborative to Advance Normative Change. And the goal of the Learning Collaborative is to integrate norms into normative and behavior change initiatives. Can you shift the slides, Kate, please? Could you go back one? I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Sarah missing a slide, but that's okay. Our goal is to integrate social norms into behavior change initiatives and to improve social norms program implementation and evaluation. We aim to do this by strengthening networks and generating and sharing knowledge as we're doing today. Next slide. So the webinar, the Learning Collaborative is a global learning collaborative, as you can see here, but it also has a number of regional communities. You can see that we include regional networks in Nigeria, West and East Africa, and Southeast Asia. This initiative is supported by multiple donors, including USAID, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Hewlett Foundation. Next, please. Well, here's our goals slide. So here you can see the goals of the Learning Collaborative, as I mentioned before, to integrate social norms by sharing evidence to strengthening networks and applying new knowledge. Next, please. So the webinar today focuses on one of the barriers that the Learning Collaborative seeks to address, the paucity of tested social norms measures and a weak evidence base on social norm shifting programs. Next. The Learning Collaborative has been working to address this gap by producing resources on monitoring, learning, and evaluation of norm shifting programs. Next. And by compiling summaries of social norms programs and associated measurement tools on this map on the Align program. Next. All of these resources can be found on the LC homepage at this link. If you're interested in joining the Learning Collaborative, you can go to that link and sign up. So before I wrap up, I'd just like to talk about social norms for a moment. Social norms theory provides a helpful basis to understand child marriage and how to end it. It suggests that child marriage may persist not only because of individually held values and beliefs, but also because many people in a community, or most people in a community, believe that others marry their children early and they're expected to behave accordingly in order to maintain social cohesion. Social norms, of course, are different than individual attitudes and beliefs. They're the unwritten rules about what is correct behavior. They're what people believe is typical and appropriate, and they're often defined in relation to a reference group. Social norms are influenced by belief systems, perceptions of what others expect and do, and sometimes by perceived rewards and sanctions. Next, please. So norms are embedded in formal and informal institutions and produced and reproduced by social interaction. This flower visual is a way of conceptualizing the socio-ecological model, demonstrates that social norms permeate through all levels of society, and highlights our understanding that power and norms are at the heart of the human ecosystem. It also shows that social norms are only one of many factors which influence early and forced marriage. Resources, individual factors, and institutional and macro level structures, of course, also are very important drivers of child marriage. Next, please. Next slide. Yes, thanks. If you'd like to receive information or participate in the Learning Collaborative, you can go to this link and register either for the Global Learning Collaborative or one of the regional groups that I mentioned earlier. So with that introduction, I'd like to turn it back over to Suzanne.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thanks to the Learning Collaborative for hosting us today. So we're going to ask now, recognizing that a lot of folks on the call come from more of a norms background and may not be as familiar with the issue of child marriage, we're going to ask Shipra Jha, who is the head of Asia engagement for Girls Not Brides, to just talk for a couple of minutes about child marriage and how social norms affect them from her perspective. On to you, Shipra.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you for inviting Girls Not Brides to this webinar today. So just to quickly give a background to what child marriage is and how it impacts the world. As you know, around 12 million girls are married worldwide everywhere. Next, please. The first slide, please, Suzanne. Yeah. So every year, 12 million girls are married before the age of 18, and this is a figure which is going to increase in the COVID and post-COVID period. Out of this figure, 38% of girls are married under the age of 18 in Sub-Saharan Africa, and where I'm based, where I work, 30% in South Asia, 25% in Latin America and Caribbean, and 17% in Middle East and North America. So it's a global issue, it's a global problem affecting all parts of the world. Next, please. What's the impact? It's a never-ending cycle of human rights violations on girls and women. It has huge complications on their health. Girls who are married earlier face a lot of physical, sexual, and emotional violence. Education ends with child marriage, child early and forced marriage, and also it traps girls and families in a vicious circle of poverty with no way out of these marriages and unions. Also, it is costing the global economy trillions of dollars, and also it limits the role of women and girls from performing to their full potential, and also inhibits the decision making, and overall is not really leading to a gender equal world. Next, please. Girls Not Brides, just to give you a little bit of background, is a global civil society partnership. We are going to celebrate our 10th anniversary soon, and we have grown a lot over the last 10 years. We have 1,400 members from more than 100 countries. We have a diverse membership. Almost 30% of our members are grassroots organizations. We also have many international NGOs, and we are active in all the continents all over the world. And most of our membership is at the moment based in Africa and Asia. Next, please, Suzanne. So just to share with you about the social norms that we face in South Asia, and my colleagues can also share their experience from their parts of the world. Sexual purity and virginity at the time of marriage is really valued, and parental and family honor is linked to the girl's virginity. There is a huge premium and construct on the ideal and obedient daughter-in-law. The younger, the better, and that she will be more malleable and adjust and not raise her voice. Prevailing constructs of masculinity and gender roles are really strong, as well as the value of girls is very, very less, and they're seen as a responsibility and burden, and marriage is a means of disposing of the burden, and this is both in terms of economic as well as social, as a social responsibility. Aspirations of the girls herself are very limited, and they're not allowed to aspire and dream of anything else other than getting married. Also, there are not too many role models around, or not too many options of higher education and livelihood. So that really limits their aspirations. Also, the status of women overall, if you look at under-gender indicators in a very strong patriarchal society, that also is a very, very key challenge that we face. And overall violence against women, which is on the rise almost every year, every day. And also South Asia has a lot of age and gender-based hierarchy in the family, and the young are not supposed to raise their voice or question the elders. Next, please. And some of the strategies that we are employing to take on these challenges are strategies that our member organizations and the Girls Not Brides membership is trying to build the programs around is building agency for adolescent girls and collectivizing them into peer groups and clubs. Engaging men and boys, having more young men and boys, trying to speak to them and trying to design programs around how to engage them. Also, ongoing dialogues and reflection on gender and sexuality issue, especially with organizations which are leading programs on ending child marriage and empowering girls and women. So that they are able to address uncomfortable issues and they are able to have some kind of discussion and long ongoing discourse on social norm change. Also active citizenship and trust building with organizations which are working in communities, so that if they are there for a long time and there is trust, then they are able to also work on some of these challenging issues. And because social norm change takes a long time, and for that there has to be a long-term engagement with communities. Also, communication materials which are backed with effective interventions and which are supported with dialogue, and also some kind of tools to encourage discussion and deliberation around social norm change and how to encourage role models which are around us. So these are some of the ways and strategies with which we are trying to work around social norm change in South Asia. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you so much, Shipra. We really appreciate that. And want to thank Girls Not Brides for contributing. We'll hear from a couple of your colleagues who represent other parts of the world and hear their perspectives about how social norms influence child marriage there. But quickly at this time, we're going to ask Dr. Yvette Efebera from the Gates Foundation to just say a few words for us. Gates, as you saw, is one of the donors for the Learning Collaborative and is also a donor to Girls Not Brides, among other things. So Yvette, over to you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and to everyone for being here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I saw some colleagues from my former home in Malawi. I am, as advisor for gender-based violence and child marriage with our gender equality team at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, am excited and delighted to welcome you to what I hope will really be a robust discussion into opportunities to innovate around how we measure norms and norms change related to child marriage. At the Gates Foundation, I have had the pleasure of working closely over the last several months with 7 partner organizations, many of whom are on this call today, to craft a $4 million learning portfolio, an effort we call the Child Marriage Learning Partners Consortium, to think through and to learn how we can amplify some opportunities on child marriage research and advocacy through 2021. Today's webinar in part is inspired as a continuation of conversations this smaller group was having. And I'm so thrilled and grateful to the Learning Collaborative for bringing your leadership, your expertise, and your network towards widening the conversation and deepening the dialogue as well. So welcome again from my home in Seattle. And I very much look forward to learning from our esteemed speaker and through this robust discussion this morning.
Thank you so much, Yvette. Really appreciate your support in advancing these issues within the foundation and for us globally. So with that, let me turn it over to the main event, if you will. Dr. Holly Shakya, who is an associate professor of global public health at the University of California at San Diego. And she's going to talk to us about norms associated with child marriage and marital choice in rural Niger and an innovative approach that she's taken to measuring those. On to you, Holly.
Good morning, everyone. I say from here in San Diego, or evening, wherever you are. Thank you all so much for joining us. I would like to thank Suzanne, Natasha, Rebecca, and Kate for organizing this and for inviting me to share my work today. I'm very excited to be here. I am an associate professor of global public health at the Center on Gender Equity and Health in University of California, San Diego. My work focuses on the overlap and the intersection between social norms theory and social network analysis. and how we can apply these learnings to behavior change interventions. My work these days focuses a lot on adolescent sexual and reproductive health in low resource settings, but I also work in a lot of different contexts and a lot of different topic areas. Today, I'm going to be presenting data from rural Niger. This was a study that was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to evaluate a family planning program there. I'll talk about that more in a little bit of detail later. I'm going to start with some discussion of social norms theory and how it can relate to child marriage to sort of get us all on the same page, present the study, the analysis, and the results, and then talk some about what we can learn from this sort of analysis to move us forward in terms of measurement of social norms in this context. So next slide, please. So just to get us started, when we're talking about social norms, there are two sort of discrete constructs that we like to consider. One is descriptive norms, and descriptive norms are what we think other people are doing. We can either think that through inference or through observation. So a lot of times what we just see other people doing, that's our descriptive norm. Next slide, please. Descriptive norms tend to spread through a social learning process. So we see people doing things and we conclude that that thing is acceptable and potentially beneficial. A good example would be cell phone use. If you came into pretty much any situation in the world right now, you'd see people on their cell phones, and it would be easy to assume, one, that there's some benefit to it. Two, you're not going to be sanctioned, or there's not going to be disapproval. People are pretty much accepting of that behavior. And you might decide, okay, people are doing this, I think I'm going to do this too. Next slide, please. Injunctive norms are different in that these are our socially reinforced rules, and these tend to be spread through social influence. So these are the things that other people in our communities are invested in, whether or not we're engaged in these behaviors or not. Next slide, please. So injunctive norms tend to be reinforced through sanctions. So now if we were in a more normal circumstance and not online, in an auditorium somewhere, and a person got a cell phone call and answered the call in the middle of my talk and started speaking in a loud voice, this would be a very clear violation of a social norm that we all pretty much understand. This person would potentially incur sanctions. So people might ask them to leave the room, they may not be invited back, etc. So through these sanctions and through this reinforcement, people are most likely not going to engage in that behavior, and this is how sort of injunctive norms operate. Next slide, please. So Rebecca mentioned this briefly, and I'll mention it briefly again, which is that the reference group, these are the people that we're going to turn to for these expectations. And a reference group may be different depending on what the norm is. So for instance, in my academic world, there's going to be a reference group around how I behave, how I interact with others, maybe how I give feedback. This is not going to be the same reference group that would potentially be sanctioning me for giving candy to my children. This might be my parenting reference group. So friends and family members that are engaged or concerned about my parenting behaviors would be a different reference group than the people who care about my academic behaviors. Next, please. So the important thing I think to consider, and I really would like to focus on this point for a second, is that norms like child marriage, there are norms that are not necessarily deeply engaged and embedded in cultural contexts, but norms like child marriage tend to be. So if we think of this and we look at the idea of cultural models, which I can't go into detail here in 13 minutes, but cultural models, if we want to think about it as sort of the foundation of, in a certain cultural context, what is the ideal life? What is the ideal identity of the individual within that context? This sort of feeds into and is similar to what we consider what we call gender norms. So what is the ideal woman in a certain context? In very patriarchal collectivist contexts, the idea of an ideal woman may be submissive, may be hardworking, doesn't argue with her husband, gives to others. So there's an idea of what an ideal woman is like. These gender norms, these sort of cultural ideas of what the ideal person as a male or female might be, can feed into then specific social norms for specific behaviors. So child marriage then falls into a specific social norm that's being fed potentially by gender norms and cultural models at a sort of more foundational level within a context. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about social norms and child marriage, we can very simplistically divide this into two sort of contexts. So in Latin America, US places in sub-Saharan Africa, we see that child marriage may be child-led, and as the result of what we would call maybe weak social control, versus places like India, Ethiopia, and Niger, which have contexts of much stronger social control. Next slide, please. So in these contexts of weak social control, young people, because of complex reasons involving maybe poverty, instability in the family, again, lack of social control through family and community members, may prematurely decide to hook up with somebody, get pregnant, partner up. And while parents may not approve of this, they don't necessarily have the social control within that context to prevent it. Next slide, please. Whereas in other contexts, Niger being one of them, mostly what we see is child marriage being driven by strong social control. So family members and community members supporting and promoting child marriage as a way to prevent adolescent pregnancy, as a way to protect the honor of the family, for religious reasons, in order to move children ahead into their ideal roles as mothers and wives. And understanding these different contexts and how social norms work within them is a really key part to understanding how it can be prevented. Next slide, please. So here, when we're talking about Niger, we have one of the most extreme contexts in the world in terms of child marriage and early pregnancy. So 76% of girls in Niger are married by the age of 18, and 50% of them have already given birth by that time. The total fertility rate in Niger is over 7. So we have very high rates of child marriage, very high rates of adolescent pregnancy, and very high fertility rate overall. Next, please. So this study that I'm going to be discussing briefly was in the context of the Reaching Married Adolescents intervention. This intervention was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and we are using data that was from the monitoring and the evaluation component of that study. Again, Gates funded that, and that was led by Dr. Jay Silverman, my colleague. Next, please. So we had 3 waves of data in the study. We've used 2 of them here. We have interviews with both the wives and husbands, and we have interviews from people in both the treatment and control. And I believe the final N, including everybody and the men that were available, was about 500 people. So what primary outcomes from the female survey, we have the age of marriage reported by girls was a mean of 14. So the average age of marriage in this survey, 14 years old. And then we have this measure of reported marital choice. And we asked respondents who chose the marriage or who chose the partner. And if the girls said that they themselves chose or they chose with the help of someone else, then we categorize that as the respondent had some say in this marriage. And if the respondent did not reply that she had any say whatsoever, then she was categorized as no say. 82% of the girls in this survey said that they had some choice. Next. Then we have, back one, please. Okay. Primary predictors at the individual level. These predictors came from female and male surveys in waves 1 and wave 2. The reason for that is we did not have the injunctive norms measures in waves 1. So we had injunctive norms measures at wave 2. This is not ideal, and I'll discuss this a little bit later. We had attitudes, so individuals responded, the men and women responded what they believe the optimal age of marriage for girls is. The injunctive norms, what age would people in your community say is the best age for a woman to get married? And do people in the village expect girls to decide when and who to marry? Next, please. Then we took many of these individual predictors and aggregated them village level to get community level measures. So again, we had the attitudes, the injunctive norms, and then we created descriptive norms measures based on the age of marriage of each girl, girls reported marital choice, and then the husbands were also asked who had chosen, how much choice the girls had had in the marital choice, basically who decided that you two were going to get married. And again, if the respondent, the husband in this case, reported the girl had some choice, then we categorize that as girl having marital choice. Next, please. So our results were very interesting. We found that the injunctive norm, so when men in the village reported that the community supports marital choice, this was associated both with girls' older age of marriage and with individual girls reporting marital choice. And the descriptive norm, when girls reported marital choice at the village level, when we aggregated that at the village level, that was also associated with an older age of marriage for girls and with girls' reports of marital choice. Next, please. And then we saw also that the girls aggregate, when the girls themselves reported norms that the community supports marital choice, that was also associated with girls reporting of marital choice. Next slide, please. One of the interesting and important things was that when we included these aggregate measures into our analyses, all of the individual measures dropped significance. So what we saw was that what was really important, what was sort of driving these associations were these aggregate community measures, these norms at the higher level versus the individual's own reports. Next, please. Okay, so now to just discuss some of the things that could have been done, we could have done better in this, or to just consider in terms of future research. One was that the husbands and wives accounts of the wives' marital choice were not aligned. So 82% of the girls said that they had marital choice, whereas only 33% of the husbands reported that. I thought that was very interesting, and it's an important issue of measurement. What are people actually reporting? How are they interpreting the question? Why do women think that they had marital choice and their husbands did not think that they had a marital choice? Was this an aspect of communication, how they interpreted the question? But if we're thinking about marital choice, we want to be able to be clear on this so we actually understand what we're measuring and working on. Next slide. We did not have injunctive norms questions in wave 1, so we used them from wave 2. And basically, we sort of mixed the data together to do a cross-sectional analysis that wasn't entirely cross-sectional because we had 2 waves of data. We did control, of course, for whether people were in the treatment arm or not, which could have impacted what wave 2 norms were reported, but this was not ideal. This is sort of an obvious thing, but it is important to think ahead of time when you're doing your surveys what you actually want to measure, and if norms are part of it, to make sure that you sort of address and think about that. Next question, next slide, please. We did not have a counterfactual for the injunctive norms. So what I mean by that is when we ask what age would people in your community say is the best age for a girl to get married, and we use that question, we don't know what the counterfactual is. So if a girl got married earlier than that or later than that, would people in the community react badly to it? We don't know the answer to that, and I think that's a very important issue in terms of understanding injunctive norms, their power, and the sanctions for them. Next, please. We did not have a way to measure diffusion. When we were discussing this webinar, the issue of diffusion came up, and I said, we can't talk about diffusion here. Part of the problem is that everybody in the village were in the same treatment group. So we don't have people within the same sort of social cluster who were either in the treatment group or not. So we can't really easily see whether norms changed across people because we don't have that measured. Also, the other way that we could be doing this is taking social network measures, and this is my expertise and what I always like to do, and so the lack of that, of course, is sad. But social network measures allow us to see where norms cluster, where they cluster beyond just the initial targeted participants, and where they change across social space. Next. Okay, and so the final thing that I'd like to end with here are, it's the question of cultural models. So you see, I actually spent a long time making this messy little graphic, and the reason was I wanted it to look a little messy. It's not a very clean ecological model where everything's like evenly spaced. This is because none of this is even. So for instance, if we're thinking about family planning in this context, and we're not looking at child marriage norms, fertility norms, and the cultural models that are feeding into these, we are potentially missing a lot of the foundational sort of context that's moving these behaviors. And there's a lot of overlap here. There are many other things that are that contribute to these issues. And so trying to look at it more holistically and understand the connections between these things is important. Just what we found in this data is that marital choice and age of marriage, the norms around these and behaviors around these seem to be very intricately linked. And by looking at them together, we have a more nuanced way and understanding of addressing these problems. Next, please. Thank you. That's the last slide. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Citation.
Thank you so much, Holly, for that really informative presentation. While you were presenting, there's a really interesting chat discussion taking place around what is marital choice, how do you really understand if girls are choosing, and about the evolving capacities of the adolescent to make decisions like this. So please, yeah, keep chatting. There was another set of questions came in, some to me directly about geography and whether and how norms compare or differ across settings and regions. And what I'd like to do now is turn to a couple of people who kindly in advance gave me the okay to call on them to represent some of the different perspectives from different regions. So let me first call to Eugenia from Girls Not Brides, Latin America, Caribbean, to provide just a couple of thoughts from her perspective. Eugenia?
Hi. Well, for me, as you know, in the region, the issue of child marriage is not even like conceptualized. We have different concepts and theories to explain the different context. And it's always very interesting to see how common the issue and the norms are globally, but also how they express different in the different regions. We don't have enough information about drivers, and we don't have enough information about the specific social norms. It usually takes for granted that in the indigenous communities is where we have more child marriage as a problem, and we even have what our colleagues from the indigenous groups call selling girls, no? That this is like very similar to what happens in India, that the dowry custom for girls, and we do have like the youth movement, a big perspective of the adolescent initiated marriage as a matter of choice, no? And there is even some organizations that define it as the right to marriage that adolescents have. So I think that the main social norms that Shipra was explaining or presenting, they also act in Latin America. And one of the main pushbacks to transform those norms that inhibit the autonomy of young people is to empower them to decide on their sexuality, and marriage is like an extension of that conception, and the evolving capacities is brought to the conversation. So for us, that's one strong set of the movement and the understanding, and the other one is this more structural analysis of which are the structural causes of child marriage would be more focused on the economy factor and how marriage has always been used as a way for women to have some insurance, economical insurance, and how we need to see the gender norms roles of women as wives and mothers expressing through the full cycle and including the professional work, no? Like, if you get out of that woman role, then when you go to the professional sector, then you will accept more work and less pay. So this other trend of understanding child marriage as part of the gender inequality through the life cycle is still there, and it is very, very rooted in the patriarchal norms and the survival strategies for families and girls.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Is that okay? Yeah, I just want to make sure we get some other perspectives in here. Thank you very much for those useful thoughts. Can we turn to Yvette from Girls Not Brides Africa? And if you can aim for 2 minutes or less, that'd be great. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Suzanne. And just building from where Ihenya has left off is in the sense that there are many factors that contribute towards child marriage, but I'll focus on communities' traditions across Africa that really have led to increased cases of prevalence of child marriage. If you're looking at communities in Ethiopia that practice kidnapping of girls, where the girls are hidden and raped and then assumed to be married thereafter, or in South Africa, where a young woman is kidnapped with the intention of compelling the girl's family to endorse marriage negotiations. In West Africa, we have communities in Ghana, Benin, and Togo, which a young girl, a virgin particularly, is offered to a local priest in exchange for God's forgiveness for the particular family, in often cases a man who has often committed a crime. We're looking at tradition that is used to legitimize child marriage. And just going back to the question around norms, and particularly looking at the emphasis around gender norms, recognizing the role patriarchy plays in defining power and privilege in our communities, therefore discriminating against girls, and questioning really the discussion around the girls having choice to get into these marriages, where we do know there are cases of peer-to-peer marriages where the adolescents have decided using their agency to get married. We recognize that a lot of the cases across the continent are for marriages where the girls actually have no choice, and therefore their futures are impacted. So for me, I would also like to go back to the question around diffusion and looking at where our communities and the role the communities can play in reducing instances and cases of child marriage, recognizing their abilities to create their own initiatives and how we can amplify where cases are working well. Niger has been used as an example where we can document the practices that are happening on ending child marriage, utilizing the opinion leaders whose role has been to pass on this culture from one generation to generation. So really documenting how change can happen through traditional and religious leaders, through political leaders who are campaigning for policies to be implemented to protect the rights of adolescents and in particular girls. And just to add in conclusion, that for us, it's also an issue of utilizing the media to change perspectives so that what is seen as the norm could be what is seen as the norm and the ordinary, which perpetuates child marriage, could then be seen as not ordinary, and for us to create changes in the communities that we live in so that public spaces amplify visions of a different world where girls actually do not get married before they're ready to get married.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Yvette. Points to the importance of that broader environment in shifting those norms. Let me ask either Joseph or Massimiliano from UNICEF. One of you wanted to weigh in? Whoever
Joseph?
unmutes. Okay.
Okay, this is Massimiliano. In the meantime, maybe I will take the floor. Thanks so much for the opportunity. I have just two quick points. One question, actually, very simple, is why injunctive norms were not included in the first wave of this particular research in Niger. I'm particularly interested to hear from Ollie. And also on the second, let's say, comment and then question at the same time for the presenter is we know that when we do surveys overall, when try to measure, especially things related to behaviors, to attitudes, to perspectives and beliefs, there is a lot of desirability bias, no, from the respondents, or there is potentially a lot of desirability bias. In our programs in UNICEF, in our region, we are trying to use a lot of the vignettes, so fictional stories, when we ask questions about what people believe, other people do, etc., in their community. And I'm wondering if that has been used by Ollie, or if there are any other techniques that could be applied, especially when social networks are very close, like in those villages that have been mentioned in Niger. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Holly, I'm sending you a couple of the questions as they come in. And I think to add to that, Massimiliano's questions, if you can start to think about just quickly summarizing responses. I'm going to ask one more person to weigh in, and then we'll turn it back to Holly to address some of these points. So at this point, Nafissatou Diop from UNFPA, are you able to unmute yourself and say a few words?
Thank you so much, and thank you for those results. I'm really dying to have more information about the, and read the paper eventually, or the report that will be produced, because there is a lot of questions, and I know that the presentation needed to be short, so not and not be able to really tackle a lot of interesting components. So I think that I just want to add a small element. I think that today, in the measurement of social norms, which is still very tricky, we really need to put ourselves in a complex environment, and that environment means that it's not probably the way to look at it as, that's a small village in Niger, where girls have been married, and so the environment or the unit of observation is that village. I think that we need to look at the things in a more complex way, with all the threats and humanitarian context. With the modernity element and all the threats, regarding particularly safety of the girls, safety of a community, safety of a country, and that has a lot of implication on how actually people are reacting to some of these situations, and decide to enter into practices, norms that for us is harmful. So I just want to add that when we talk about social norms and social norm change, there is often this vision that it takes time, and I'm hearing that a lot. And sometimes I'm just wondering if we are talking about social norm, or are we talking about, in general, maybe behavior change. And so there is a difference for me, because I think that from a lot of very strong expert observation and issues that we have seen a shift, and a brutal shift sometimes in behavior. And I think that we need to question the why that change can be so brutal and can happen, and a lot of examples, around the world, are there. So this long-term vision needs to be really reassessed, and looking at what are the external factors, or some indigenous factors, compared to some of the collective actions and intervention. And I think that the last one that I want to say is about this issue. It was touched a little bit, but the issue of femininity, the issue of purity, the issue of virginity, the issue of sexuality and reproductive social security. I can use this kind of term. Let's revisit those concepts and let's look at exactly what that means, when we want to address the issue of social norm. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really great points and comments and questions, both from the folks who've just weighed in speaking, as well as in the chat box here. Right before we turn it back over to Holly to answer some of these questions, I'm going to send a couple of links. There's a request for more information on more resources. The Align platform that Rebecca mentioned earlier does host a nice set of resources specifically on child marriage, and specifically a couple of papers on norms as they refer to child marriage. So for now, let me ask Holly if you can jump back in. A lot of questions here about the methodology, and explain your point about the counterfactual. Say more about social network measures, talk more about some of the sanctions that were imposed for defying the norm of child marriage, why injunctive norms weren't measured in the first phase, and whether you used vignettes or positive deviance. And then I think a broad question, which is just to share some of the top line lessons learned from doing this research. A lot of questions. I think this could go on for a full lecture session, but if you could try to just summarize in a couple of minutes, that'd be great. And then we'll come back to more questions and inputs from other folks.
Okay. Well, so first of all, thank you to everybody for chiming in and being so engaged in this topic. This obviously is a very complex topic with a lot of nuances, and trying to present even what the work I did in 12 minutes was really challenging. And for us to get through this whole sort of idea comprehensively in 75 minutes is also not possible. But at least we can bring up key points and have, ideas for future thought and future research. So the first thing I would like to make clear is that the project, the Reaching Married Adolescence project, was a project that was designed for girls who are already married to promote family planning use. So this was not a child marriage project at all. I was not really brought into it until we got into the second wave of data. So the reason that there were no injunctive norms in the first wave of data were because I wasn't on the project yet, and because the project was focused on family planning. So there were literally about 9,000 questions on every aspect of family planning in wave one, and I don't really think much at all in terms of age of marriage, marital choice. What marital choice was in there, but the injunctive norms and more nuanced questions around child marriage weren't included until wave two. Sorry, my son just came in. So that answers the question as to why some of these things weren't in there, and keeping in mind the fact that the focus of the project was family planning. Now, when I got into the project and I understood the context and looked at what we were doing, it seemed obvious that we needed to ask about child marriage in this context, but the initial goal of the project was family planning, and therefore that's why the child marriage aspect of it is low. Let's see, one of the questions was, could you mention some of the sanctions that were imposed for defying the norm of child marriage? The answer to that question is that I don't know. And this is where I was getting into this issue of counterfactuals. So what I meant by that was, when you ask the question, at what age is it ideal for a girl to get married? When you ask that question and somebody says, oh, 15. All right, we get the idea that people in this community support or believe that around 15 years old may be the ideal age of getting married. But what we don't understand is what happens if somebody violates that? What happens if a family marries their daughter off at age, somebody marries their daughter off at 18? To really understand the strength of the norm and the possible sanctions that that could be incurred, you want to know this, and we didn't know this. And therefore, the answer to the question is, what were the sanctions if the norm of child marriage was defied? I don't know the answer to that question. Let's see. How did this program measure if child marriage decreased at the end of the program? It did not. First of all of the participants were already married. So to really look at child marriage in terms of what this intervention could have done in child marriage in these communities, I have no idea, because people were already married. Now, what I'm going to say is that the Reaching Married Adolescents program dealt with gender norms. So they went into families, there were household visits and small group visits, and talked about gender norms, and seemed to have made some changes in gender norms from baseline to the second wave of data. It's possible that by shifting gender norms, they were able to shift child marriage within these communities. But because the people we interviewed were already married, we don't know whether this happened or not. I will say that we had a social network component we added onto this, and it seemed very likely that some of the intervention messages were just diffusing from original participants to people in their social networks. So one of the questions was, what can we say more about social network measures and how have we used them? So in fact, we have a whole social network component that we added onto this. Now, as I mentioned, because the initial participants were already married, and because child marriage wasn't the focus of the project, our social network component was focused on family planning. And how we do that, if somebody wants to email me separately, I can send them my papers on how I've done social network analysis. That's a whole talk by itself. There's many ways of doing it. But by doing that, what we're able to see is if that person A, Holly, goes through some kind of program on, academic norms and is friends with someone, Suzanne, who's not in that program, and I'm talking to Suzanne about what I've learned, if I've measured Suzanne's behaviors and attitudes along with Holly's, it's easier for me to tell whether this program is diffusing or not. Let's see. Okay, counterfactuals, we don't know whether, okay, so then somebody asks what the lessons around the measurement of norms around child marriage. I think that the measurement of norms around child marriage has to include the other components, the other norms that are potentially linked with the cultural models and the overall gender norms within the communities. That without looking at those different things, we don't understand how the norm of child marriage is operating on its own. And people have been bringing up ideas about safety, about protecting girls from, unhappy or unacceptable sexual events that could take place as adolescents. And these are all important issues and complex issues that, again, also feed into this. So if there's norms around girls' sexuality and there's perceptions that girls aren't safe, this plays into it. So the last slide that I showed where everything's sort of jumbled together, unfortunately, I think that's the case, that we can't look at things very easily in isolation, and we need to sort of start pinpointing what things really go together with what other things in order to be able to understand how to address them.
Great. A lot of
questions.
I think you've got, I think there are some big questions here about how do we measure social norms at scale regarding child marriage, and that is, of course, the big question that I think we're trying to tackle just a little piece of here. But I think we're getting a good sense of some of the challenges in the chat box. Thank you all for such useful contributions in the chat box. And let's, yes, we can download the chat box and make sure that that's shared with folks afterward. We did schedule this to go to 11:15, knowing that there would be so many experts on the call and folks would have different perspectives that they wanted to share. So we've got a few minutes here. If you do want to share something beyond in the chat box and want to chime in, just send a quick note on the chat. I can ask now, since we did have two people from UNICEF who wanted to speak in. We heard from Massimiliano. Daniel, Joseph Navarrete, if you're on and you had something to add, please feel free.
Well, thank you very much, Susan. Nothing to add from my side.
There we go. Oh, I think you say nothing to add, Joseph. Anyone else? I'm gonna open it up for anyone now. Folks are happy, I suppose, to just chime in on the chat box, which is fantastic. I'll give it another few seconds here in case anyone wants to chime in. A lot of questions. Okay. Some really good, tough questions here, measuring the different types of norms regarding child marriage in different contexts across time. I think we're not quite there, but some of the resources that we've referred to in the chat box that you can find on the Emerge platform as well as the Align platform give you a sense of what we do currently have and what folks are working on now. And if not marrying their girls, then what? Rafat, I've seen you have a lot of comments that you've been contributing here. I wonder if you might be willing to unmute yourself and chime in just with a couple of perspectives. Rafat Shuja.
Yeah, thank you, Susan, for hearing me and reading me out. So I'm for last 5 years I'm working with the child marriage programs, and I've been I did my 3 programs on child marriage, still part of MTBA and Girls Not Bride and everything. So we have a prevention chapter, and I am coordinating it in Pakistan. So I'm from Pakistan, Islamabad. There are so many questions, and I'm so lucky to have log in today after coming back from office, and I just want to be a part of this chat. Thank you so much. There are many things I've seen, recently we have gone through a positive deviance research, and we found some good elements from that. When we have started Fight Back, Marriage No Child's Play program, we have seen that the concept of good girls and bad girls, and the contribution of mother in child marriage, and how the shaking can be turned over if mother is convincing their husband and family, and so things like that. At the end of the program, when we were conducting this positive deviance social norm research, we have seen a very astonishing report that we have seen, if you relate the life of girl and the health of girl component with the child marriage, we have seen quite a positive deviance in fathers making decision towards not marrying their girl at early age. That's why I was asking about the positive deviance. I want to reassure if it's the case everywhere, if you connect the bridge between health component with the child marriage, will it work? If you connect the bridge between economic power, then it can delay the child marriage. If you connect the education with child marriage, delay the child marriage. We just want to come up with more and more aspect and more assurance on what we are doing. That's why I was asking. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you. Helpful to have this, and thanks for the work that you're doing. One of the things that we wanted to convey on this call is the complexity of norms and how they differ in different places, as well as obviously the complexity of measuring norms and norm change. And also to convey that there are innovative ways to try to do that, But at the same time, a lot of the solutions that you all are putting forward in the chat box, I think, understand norms, but don't necessarily require a strict measurement of norms, right? A lot of the interventions around comprehensive sexuality and improving the perspective of community members and families around the value of the girl, the importance of girls' education and economic opportunities, those are interventions that we know are important for so many aspects of girls' lives, including to prevent child marriage. And I suppose one could question how much you actually need to measure norms and norm change as a way to design programs or evaluate the effective programs. And there's a balance there, right? Because it is complex and it takes time and it takes money to do these measurements well. And we know what interventions are probably going to be needed. So just wanted to throw those challenges out there to you. So what I'd like to do at this point is to, and the norms do need to be deconstructed and understand what it is that's contributing to change. But, you know, I think there is that balance between what some researchers and donors may want to see in terms of very concrete, specific, measurable changes that result from those interventions versus, you know, knowing in other ways, perhaps that these interventions are important, and to some extent we need to trust history and trust what the girls are saying, that they'll work. So just to point out very simplistically, I think, that divide. But what I'd like to do now is to ask Dr. Natasha Stevanovic from Georgetown University to kind of close us out. Dr. Stevanovic, Natasha, who I worked with previously, is the Senior Research Officer and Coordinator of the Gender and Health Portfolio at the Institute of Reproductive Health and the Center for Child and Human Development at Georgetown University. So Natasha, let's turn it over to you and then we'll close this out.
Thanks. Thank you, Suzanne. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone. Also, bonjour and bonsoir to some of my Francophone colleagues I see on the phone here. So glad to see some names that I recognize. So I'm not going to answer the question that Suzanne posed, which is the million-dollar question around how much do you actually measure norms as a way to design a program, but rather I thought that I'd like to make 3 brief points. I only have a few minutes here, and I thought that what I'd do is, as a way to summarize the key points that were discussed, I would at the same time highlight some important contributions of Holly's work, as it provides some real opportunities to innovate around how we measure norms, as Dr. Yvette noted in the beginning of the talk. So on this, what we've learned is that although clearly more work is needed to improve social norms measurement, that it is actually possible to measure norms at scale, but to do so, it also means that different approaches are needed to go beyond just measuring activities and individual attitudes and behaviors. And like Holly's study, she showed that we can actually measure attitudes, behavior, descriptive, and injunctive norms together. In terms of building data for research, I thought her work was great in terms of providing a new set of data from both girls and husbands, almost unlike most studies on child marriage that typically focus on girls. Another interesting contribution I thought is really the way in which Dr. Holly's work really uncovers the evidence on the interrelationship of norms by really looking at the interrelationship between age at marriage and marital choice. I thought this was also pretty innovative. And finally, a point that really emerged several times in discussion is really the context, right? The importance of context and or cultural model, as Holly described it. And understanding different contexts and how social norms work within that context is absolutely important for measurement. But also wanted to say that, and that was a note that I saw in the chat, that, child marriage per se, right, is not a social norm, but it's really about, controlling female sexuality within patriarchal system, and also about the value of a girl and a woman. And those norms really play out differently depending on where you are in the world. But another key point that I think Nafissatou mentioned is really about accounting for the structural environment, right? That it's really how these norms really operate within, within the law, the policy, the economic environment, and whether you are in a humanitarian context. The second point I wanted to say is really goes back to some of the issues that were raised around the issue of choice and decision. So I think that anyone here working on child marriage will agree that fostering the agency of adolescent girls is really one key aspect in reducing child marriage, as Shipra noted. But it can't happen if we don't really understand how social norms intersect with agency, right? And so this means, as Holly showed, that it's equally important to address norms at the household and community level, meaning exploring the norms of both female and male caregivers, but also that of husbands and community members. But again, doing so within the structural system. And for my third point, which is more of a FYI, but I'd like to come back to the Learning Collaborative to advance normative change, which Rebecca mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, and bring to your attention a social norm activity that IRH, UCSD, and the Learning Collaborative are working on together. And as some of you know, for the past 4 years, the Learning Collaborative has been very committed in terms of raising awareness and understanding and the ability to address and measure social norms. And one step towards that direction is the Social Norms Atlas. And Kate, I see you put the slide, thank you. So the Social Norms Atlas is an online and PDF resource that intends to offer a high-level overview of illustrative behaviors and social norms and attitudes in specific development sectors and contexts. It's intended for program planners, implementers, researchers, and evaluators who are not necessarily experts on social norms, but are interested in building vocabulary and knowledge on norms that are relevant to a particular development sectors in which they work. Next slide. So, yeah, thank you. So the sectors that the Social Norms Atlas covers, as you see here, include 10 sectors: family planning and reproductive health, intimate partner violence, women's economic empowerment, harmful traditional practices, education, nutrition, violence against children, provider behavior, technology, and COVID. Next slide. So the way that we structured the Social Norms Atlas is very user-friendly with, I would say, 3 specific sections, including an overall general discussion on what social norms are, what they're not, how they differ from attitudes. And then that's when we sort of delve into each, sector, and we provide these sector-specific chapters that include examples of behaviors and related social norms and attitudes based on evidence in specific contexts. We also provide some promising strategies for addressing social norms in that particular sector with a brief case study and links to resources and evidence. And finally, in our sort of last section of the atlases, we're bringing in sort of a cross sectoral lens, right? Revealing which norms or which meta norms may be cross-cutting. We're planning on launching the Social Norms Atlas virtually in January 2021 in partnership with Align and a social media campaign. And just wanted to add that if you want more information about the Social Norms Atlas, please feel free to reach out to me or Rebecca. I'm going to end here. So I think we learned a lot today and we'll continue to learn. And thank you all again for your participation from all over the world and for your great work in social norms and child marriage. Thank you all.
Thank you, Natasha. Thanks to you, to Rebecca, to Holly, to Shipra, to Kate, who is behind all the logistics of this, and who we will be looking to share the recording as well as the chat. I think such useful contributions in the chat here. So thank you, everyone, and thanks to the Gates Foundation for supporting the Learning Collaborative, as well as USAID and the Hewitt Foundation. Really appreciate everyone's participation. Let's continue the discussion. So much more that we have to learn, and thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. It's been great. Thanks, Holly.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you all. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.